Alright, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. Sorry I didn't put out video yesterday. Having a lot of technical issues and time issues, and the same is true today, but we'll see if we can scratch something out. This is an educational channel, and we try to inform you about great theories and discoveries and concepts that you have never heard before because they've been suppressed outside of your purview. Things that would really benefit your life in terms of spiritual, mental, and physical health, but things that the powers that be don't want you to know about. And this is another Bible Decode. I think this is number 336. And we've been exploring the world of deism a little bit. And this is definitely for the truthers out there, many of whom will tell you that Christianity is the way to go for this golden age that's coming up, and that the founders of the United States Republic were all Christians, and we're going to go back to that. But it turns out that many of the most influential founders of the United States were actually not Christians, but they were deists. And Thomas Paine is one of the most outspoken, was one of the most outspoken deists. It was 250 years ago today that Thomas Paine's Common Sense was published, which is more or less a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. But we are looking at his later work that is called Age of Reason, which exposes his deist point of view. And the deists believe in God. They believe in one God. But they believe that that one God did not write any of the books of God, so-called, the Old and New Testaments, the Quran, and any of these other holy books were not written by God, they were written by man. The way that we can understand God, come to a realization about God, is by using our God-given reason and other faculties that we have in order to behold the creation itself. That is the Word of God for Thomas Paine, the creation of the universe, whether it's looking at the stars, looking at the at nature, looking through a microscope. These are the ways that a deist approaches God, not through some words in a limited language that are subject to fraud and mistranslations and incompetence, carelessness. All of these things over the years add up, and even if the text of these so-called books of God are, not beset with fraud itself, they still don't convey the essence of God in the way that the creation does. So we are just starting up with chapter, the second part 2 of Age of Reason, and he's going over the Old Testament here. And I think we left off where he was just talking about Numbers 12:3, which says, "Now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were on the face of the earth." And he's saying, well, if Moses is the author of the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Old Testament, also known as the Torah, then that would be Moses is writing that about himself. Now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were on the face of the earth. And he says, if Moses said this of himself, instead of being the meekest of men, he was one of the most vain and arrogant coxcombs. And the advocates for those books may now take which side they please, for both sides are against them. If Moses was not the author, the books are without authority. And if he was the author is without credit, because to boast of meekness is the reverse of meekness, and is a lie in sentiment. In Deuteronomy, the style and manner of writing marks more evidently than in the former books that Moses is not the writer. The manner here used is dramatical. The writer opens the subject by a short introductory discourse, then introduces Moses as in the act of speaking. And when he has made Moses finish his harangue, the writer resumes his own part and speaks till he brings Moses forward again, and at last closes the scene with an account of the death, funeral, and character of Moses. This interchange of speakers occurs 4 times in this book, from the first verse of the first chapter to the end of the 5th verse. It is the writer who speaks. He then introduces Moses as in the act of making his harangue. And this continues to the end of the 40th verse of the 4th chapter. Here the writer drops Moses and speaks historically of what was done in consequence of what Moses, when living, is supposed to have said, and which the writer has dramatically rehearsed. The writer opens the subject again in the first verse of the 5th chapter, though it is only by saying that Moses called the people of Israel together. He then introduces Moses as before, and continues him as in the act of speaking to the end of the 26th chapter. He does the same thing at the beginning of the 27th chapter, and continues Moses as in the act of speaking to the end of the 28th chapter. At the 29th chapter, the writer speaks again through the whole of this verse and the first line of the 2nd verse, where he introduces Moses for the last time, and continues him as in the act of speaking to the end of the 33rd chapter. The writer, having now finished the rehearsal on the part of Moses, comes forward and speaks through the whole of the last chapter. He begins by telling the reader that Moses went up to the top of Pisgah, that he saw from thence the land which had been promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he, Moses, died there in the land of Moab, that he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, but that no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day, that is, unto the time in which the writer lived, who wrote the book of Deuteronomy. The writer then tells us that Moses was 110 years of age when he died, that his eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. And he concludes by saying that there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom, says this anonymous writer, the Lord knew face to face. I thought Moses was 120, but I could be wrong about that. Having thus shown, as far as grammatical evidence implies, that Moses was not the writer of those books, I will, after making a few observations on the inconsistencies of the writer of this book of Deuteronomy, proceed to show from the historical and chronological evidence contained in those books that Moses was not, because he could not be, the writer of them, and consequently that there is no authority for believing that the inhuman and horrid butcheries of men, women, and children told of in those books were done, as those books say they were, at the command of God. It is a duty incumbent on every true deist that he vindicates the moral justice of God against the calumnies of the Bible. The writer of the book of Deuteronomy, whoever he was, for it is an anonymous work, is obscure and also contradictory with himself in the account he has given of Moses. After telling that Moses went to the top of Pisgah, and it does not appear from any account that he ever came down again, he tells us that Moses died there in the land of Moab, and that he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab. But as there is no antecedent to the pronoun he, there is no knowing who he was that did bury him. If the writer meant that he, God, buried him, how should he, the writer, know it? Or why should we, the readers, believe him? Since we know not who the writer was that tells us so, for certainly Moses could not himself tell where he was buried. The writer also tells us that no man knoweth where the sepulchre of Moses is unto this day, meaning the time in which this writer lived. How then should he know that Moses was buried in a valley in the land of Moab? For as the writer lived long after the time of Moses, as is evident from his using the expression of unto this day, meaning a great length of time after the death of Moses, he certainly was not at his funeral. And on the other hand, it is impossible that Moses himself could say that no man knoweth where the sepulchre is unto this day, to make Moses the speaker. To make Moses the speaker would be an improvement on the play of a child that hides himself and cries, "Nobody can find me, nobody can find Moses." This writer has no idea where, this writer has nowhere told us how he came by the speeches which he has put into the mouth of Moses to speak, and therefore we have a right to conclude that he either composed them himself or wrote them from oral tradition. One or the other of these is the more probable, since he has given in the 5th chapter a table of commandments in which that called the 4th commandment is different from the 4th commandment in the 20th chapter of Exodus. In that of Exodus, the reason given for keeping the 7th day is because God made the heavens and the earth in 6 days and rested on the 7th. But in that of Deuteronomy, the reason given is that it was the day on which the children of Israel came out of Egypt, and therefore, says this commandment, the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. This makes no mention of the creation, nor that of the coming out of Egypt. There are also many things given as laws of Moses in this book that are not to be found in any of the other books, among which is that inhuman and brutal law, which is in chapter 21, verses 18 through 21, which authorizes parents the father and the mother, to bring their own children to have them stoned to death for what it pleased them to call stubbornness. But priests have always been fond of preaching up Deuteronomy, for Deuteronomy preaches up tithes. And it is from this book, chapter 25, verse 4, they have taken the phrase and applied it to tithing, that thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn, and that this might not escape observation. They have noted it in the table of contents at the head of the chapter, though it is only a single verse of less than 2 lines. O priests, priests, ye are willing to be compared to an ox for the sake of tithes. Though it is impossible for us to know identically who the writer of Deuteronomy was, it is not difficult to discover him professionally, that he was some Jewish priests who lived, as I shall show in the course of this work, at least 350 years after the time of Moses. I come now to speak of the historical and chronological evidence. The chronology that I shall use is the Bible chronology, for I mean not to go out of the Bible for evidence of anything, but to make the Bible itself prove historically and chronologically that Moses is not the author of the books ascribed to him. It is therefore proper that I inform the readers that in the larger Bibles, and also in some smaller ones, there is a series of chronology printed in the margin of every page for the purpose of showing how long the historical matters stated in each page happened, or are supposed to have happened, before Christ, and consequently the distance of time between one historical circumstance and another. I begin with the book of Genesis. In Genesis 14, the writer gives an account of Lot being taken prisoner in a battle between the 4 kings against 5, and carried off, and that when the account of Lot being taken came to Abraham, that he armed all his household and marched to rescue Lot from the captors, that he pursued them unto Dan, in verse 14. To show in what manner this expression of pursuing them unto Dan applies to the case in question, I will refer to 2 circumstances, the one in America, the other in France. The city now called New York in America was originally New Amsterdam, and the town in France, lately called Havre-Marat, was before called Havre de Grace. New Amsterdam was changed to New York in the year 1664. Havre de Grace to Havre-Marat in the year 1793. Should therefore any writing be found, though without date, in which the name of New York should be mentioned, it would be certain evidence that such a writing could not have been written before, and must have been written after New Amsterdam was changed to New York, and consequently not till after the year 1664, or at least during the course of that year, and in like manner, any dateless writing with the name of Havre-Marat would be certain evidence that such a writing must have been written after Havre de Grace. Havre de Grace became Havre-Marat, and consequently not till after the year 1793, or at least during the course of that year. I now come to the application of those cases, and to show that there was no such place as Dan till many years after the death of Moses, and consequently that Moses could not be the writer of the book of Genesis, where this account of pursuing them unto Dan is given. Well, it just kind of seems like he's splitting hairs here a little bit. I mean, the account occurred hundreds of years before Moses was even born, to start with. And secondly, the account, what language is it written in? Because it was written hundreds of years before the development of Hebrew as a language. So, what language are even the Ten Commandments written on? Because Moses' life precedes the development of Hebrew, as far as I know. And so these are more fundamental problems than the kind of what's the word? Just kind of technicalities that he's getting into here. Just these kind of little minor technicalities. Anyway, the place that is called Dan in the Bible was originally a town of the Gentiles called Laish. And when the tribe of Dan seized upon this town, they changed its name to Dan, in commemoration of Dan, who was the father of that tribe and the grandson of Abraham. To establish this in proof, it is necessary to refer to Genesis chapter 18 of the book called the Book of Judges. It is there, and then, so why are we trusting the book of Judges and not trusting the book of Genesis? It's almost circular. It is there said in verse 27 that they, the Danites, came unto Laish, to a people that were quiet and secure, and they smote them with the edge of the sword, and burned the city with fire, and they built a city, in verse 28, and dwelt therein, and in verse 29 they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, howbeit the name of the city was Laish at first. This account of the Danites taking possession of Laish and changing it to Dan is placed in the book of Judges immediately after the death of Samson. Now, Samson, that's a character there who just real wholesome story there. The death of Samson is supposed to have happened in 1120 BC, and that of Moses in 1451 BC. And therefore, according to historical arrangement, the place was not called Dan until 331 years after the death of Moses. There is a striking confusion between the historical and the chronological arrangement in the book of Judges. The last 5 chapters, as they stand in the book 17 through 21, are put chronologically before all the preceding chapters. They are made to be 28 years before the 16th chapter, 266 years before the 15th chapter, 245 years before the 13th chapter, 195 years before the 9th chapter, go before the 4th, and 15 years before the 1st chapter. This shows the uncertain and fabulous state of the Bible. And when he uses the word fabulous, he's basically referring to fable. Shows the uncertain and fabulous state of the Bible according to the chronological arrangement. The taking of Laish and giving it the name of Dan is made to be 20 years after the death of Joshua, who was the successor of Moses, and by the historical order as it stands in the book, it is made to be 306 years after the death of Joshua and 331 after that of Moses. But they both exclude Moses from being the writer of Genesis, because according to either of the statements, no such place as Dan existed in the time of Moses, and therefore the writer of Genesis must have been some person who lived after the town of Laish had the name of Dan, and who that person was nobody knows, and consequently the book of Genesis is anonymous and without authority. I now come to state another point of historical and chronological evidence, and to show therefrom, as in the preceding case, that Moses is not the author of the book of Genesis. In Genesis 36, there is given a genealogy of the sons and descendants of Esau, who are called Edomites, and also a list by name of the kings of Edom, in enumerating of which it is said in verse 31, and these are the kings that reigned in Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. Now, were any dateless writing to be found in which, speaking of any past events, the writer should say, these things happened before there was any Congress in America or before there was any convention in France, it would be evidence that such writing could not have been written before, and could only be written after there was a Congress in America or a convention in France, as the case might be, and consequently that it could not be written by any person who died before there was a Congress in the one country or a convention in the other. Nothing is more frequent as well in history as in conversation than to refer to a fact in the room of a date. It is most natural so to do, because a fact fixes itself in the memory better than a date. Secondly, because the fact includes the date and serves to give two ideas at once, and this manner of speaking by circumstances implies as positively that the fact alluded to is past, and as if it was so expressed. When a person in speaking upon any matter says, it was before I was married, or before my son was born, or before I went to America, or before I went to France, it is absolutely understood and intended to be understood that he has been married, that he has had a son, that he has been in America or been in France. Language does not admit of using this mode of expression in any other sense, and whenever such an expression is found anywhere, it can only be understood in the sense in which only it could have been used. The passage, therefore, that I have quoted, that these are the kings that reigned in Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel, could only have been written after the first king began to reign over them, and consequently that the book of Genesis, so far from having been written by Moses, could not have been written till the time of Saul, at least. This is the positive sense of the passage, but the expression any king implies more kings than one, and at least it implies two, and this it will carry it to the time of David, and if taken in a general sense, it carries itself through all times of the Jewish monarchy. Had we met with this verse in any part of the Bible that professed to have been written after kings began to reign in Israel, it would have been impossible not to have seen the application of it. It happens then that this is the case. The two books of Chronicles, which give a history of all the kings of Israel, are professedly, as well as in fact, written after the Jewish monarchy began, and this verse that I have quoted and all remaining verses of Genesis 36 are word for word in 1 Chronicles 1, beginning at the 43rd verse. It was with consistency that the writer of the Chronicles could say, as he has said in 1 Chronicles 1:43, that these are the kings that reigned in Edom before there reigned any king ever, the children of Israel, because he was going to give and has given a list of the kings that had reigned in Israel. But as it is impossible that the same expression could have been used before that period, it is as certain as anything can be proved from historical language that this part of Genesis is taken from Chronicles, and that Genesis is not so old as Chronicles. and probably not so old as the Book of Homer or as Aesop's fables, admitting Homer to have been, as the tables of chronology state, contemporary with David or Solomon, and Aesop to have lived about the time of the Jewish monarchy, about the end of the Jewish monarchy. Take away from Genesis the belief that Moses was the author, on which only the strange belief that it is the Word of God has stood, and there remaining nothing of Genesis but an anonymous book of stories, fables, and traditionary or invented absurdities or of downright lies. The story of Eve and the serpent and of Noah and his ark drops to a level with the Arabian tales without the merit of being entertaining. And the account of men living to 800 and 900 years becomes as fabulous as the immortality of the giants of mythology. Besides, the character of Moses, as stated in the Bible, is the most horrid that can be imagined. If those accounts be true, he was the wretch that first began and carried on wars on the score or on the pretense of religion, and under that mask or that infatuation committed the most unexampled atrocities that are to be found in the history of any nation, of which I will state only one instance. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there, and we'll get into this instance of Moses' wretchedness when we return tomorrow. Some of this is pretty interesting and insightful. A lot of it is technicalities, and I really can't stand his style of writing, but we will continue because that's just my own pet peeve. Maybe you like it. I admire Thomas Paine in general, so we can just chalk this up to the 18th century. That's just how people wrote back then, I guess. And we will return to Thomas Paine's Age of Reason when we come back next time. Hopefully that will be tomorrow, but no guarantees. And like, share, subscribe, and comment as you see fit. Please return to find out more about Thomas Paine's take on the Old Testament here in the next episode. Have a great